You are not who you think you are in the way you think you are. You feel solid, continuous, stable. You feel like a center that sees, decides, remembers, and moves through the world. You feel like a self that exists first and then experiences reality second. But what if the order is reversed? What if the world you live in, the body you feel, and the person you believe yourself to be are not things you simply perceive, but things your brain is actively creating, moment by moment, prediction by prediction? Right now, as you sit here, nothing in your brain has direct access to reality. Light does not carry pictures. Sound does not carry voices. Touch does not carry surfaces. All that reaches your nervous system are electrical signals, fragments, and probabilities. From these incomplete pieces, your brain constructs a best guess of what is out there and who you are within it. That guess feels like certainty. It feels like truth. It feels like you. But it is not a mirror of the world. It is a controlled hallucination, guided by sensory data, shaped by memory, and stabilized by survival. From the moment you became aware of yourself as a child, something quietly extraordinary began to happen. You did not simply wake up one day and discover a self waiting inside you, fully formed and clearly defined. There was no hidden object called you, sitting somewhere in the brain, patiently waiting to be found. Instead, what slowly emerged was a pattern, a story, a sense of continuity that grew as your nervous system learned how to predict the world and your place within it. The feeling of being someone did not arrive as a discovery. It arrived as a construction, built layer by layer through experience, memory, emotion, and expectation. Every time you look in the mirror, you feel as though you are recognizing a person who has always been there. But recognition is not the same as revelation. What you are actually doing is confirming a prediction your brain has already made about what kind of organism you are and what that organism should look like. The brain is not asking, "Who am I?" in a philosophical sense. It is asking, "What kind of body must I be in order to keep surviving in this environment?" The answer to that question becomes your face, your posture, your voice, your sense of ownership over your body. The self is not uncovered, it is inferred. Think about how fragile your sense of identity really is. It can shift with mood, with memory, with context, with the people around you. In one room you feel confident. In another you feel invisible. In one conversation you feel intelligent. In another you feel uncertain. If the self were a fixed object, these shifts would not make sense. But if the self is a pattern your brain is constantly regenerating in order to navigate social and physical environments, then these changes are not weaknesses. They are evidence of an adaptive system doing exactly what it evolved to do. Your brain is always predicting not only what is out there, but who you are in relation to what is out there. When you walk into a familiar place, your body already knows how to move, where to look, how to speak, and what version of yourself to become. You do not consciously select your personality each morning. Your nervous system assembles it for you based on past experiences and present cues. The self you feel is not chosen. It is generated. Memory plays a powerful role in this process, but memory itself is not a perfect archive. Each time you remember something, you are not retrieving a stored recording. You are rebuilding an event using fragments of sensory data and emotional meaning. With every reconstruction, the memory changes slightly, and with it, the story of who you believe you have been. Your identity is therefore not only built by what you experience, but by how your brain chooses to reassemble those experiences. You are not carrying a fixed past with you. You are continuously rewriting it. This means that the you of today is not the same you of 5 years ago, even if your name, your face, and your history appear unchanged. The core feeling of being a continuous self is a powerful illusion created by the brain to keep your story coherent. Continuity feels natural because it is useful. A creature that believes it has a stable identity can make long-term plans, form social bonds, and protect itself as a single organism over time. The self persists not because it is discovered, but because it is necessary. Consider what happens when this system is disrupted. In moments of extreme stress, trauma, or deep introspection, people sometimes report feeling detached from themselves, as if watching their life from the outside. The world still exists. The body still moves, but the familiar sense of me becomes thin, distant, or unfamiliar. This is not the loss of a physical object. It is the temporary destabilization of a model the brain usually keeps running smoothly in the background. When the model wavers, the self feels unreal. Even your inner voice, the quiet narrator that seems to speak from the center of your being, is not a proof of a hidden commander inside your head. It is another prediction, another construction. The brain generates language as a way to organize thought, regulate emotion, and prepare action. The voice feels like you, because your brain assigns it ownership. But it is not a separate entity giving orders. It is the nervous system describing its own activity in a way that feels personal and intentional. This has profound consequences for how you see your fears, your habits, and your limitations. If the self were a fixed essence, then change would feel like betrayal. Growth would feel unnatural. But if the self is a pattern that is constantly being generated, then change is not a threat. It is the default state of the system. You are not meant to protect a permanent identity. You are meant to update a living model. This is why learning, therapy, reflection, and new experiences can reshape who you are at a fundamental level. You are not adding features to a finished product. You are modifying the internal predictions that define your sense of being. Each insight, each emotional breakthrough, each shift in perspective slightly rewires the story your brain tells about what kind of person you are. The self evolves because it is a process, not an object. When you say, "This is just who I am," what you are really saying is, "This is the model my brain is currently running." It feels permanent because it has been stable. But stability is not the same as immutability. The brain holds on to patterns that work and releases patterns that no longer serve survival, belonging, and meaning. Your identity is therefore less like a statue and more like a river, always flowing, always reshaping itself around new terrain. The idea that the self is not discovered but generated can feel unsettling at first, because it challenges the comforting belief that there is a single, unchanging core that defines your worth. But it also opens a quiet freedom. If the self is constructed, then it can be reconstructed. If it is learned, then it can be relearned. If it is predicted, then it can be updated. You are not trapped inside a finished version of yourself. You are participating in the ongoing creation of the person you feel yourself to be. Every choice, every thought pattern, every emotional reaction is not just an expression of who you are. It is also a small instruction to your brain about who you will become. And that means that your identity is not something you must defend. It is something that is continuously being written, quietly, invisibly, inside the living system that calls itself you. When you open your eyes each morning, it feels as though the world simply arrives. Light pours in, shapes appear, sounds drift through the air, and a complete, stable reality seems to present itself fully formed. It feels as if your mind is a window, and the world is what stands outside of it. But this feeling is not how perception actually works. Your brain is not passively receiving reality. It is actively constructing it using prediction as its primary tool. Before a single ray of light reaches your eyes, your brain has already begun to guess what it is about to see. It does this because raw sensory data is slow, incomplete, and often ambiguous. Waiting for perfect information would be dangerous in a world that demands rapid decisions. So instead of waiting, your nervous system prepares models of what is likely to be present. When sensory signals arrive, they are compared to these models. If they match closely enough, the brain accepts its own prediction as reality. What you experience is not the data itself. It is the brain's best guess, continuously updated in real time. This is why you can read sentences with missing letters and still understand them. This is why you can recognize a familiar face in poor lighting. This is why your name seems to jump out of a noisy room. Your brain is not scanning every detail equally. It is predicting what matters, filtering what does not, and filling in what is missing. You are not seeing what is objectively there. You are seeing what your brain believes is most likely to be there. Perception feels stable, but it is actually fragile. Small changes in expectation can completely reshape what you experience. When you are anxious, the world feels sharper, louder, more threatening. When you are calm, the same environment feels neutral or even comforting. The sensory input has not changed significantly. The internal model has. Your emotional state alters your predictions, and your predictions alter your reality. This is also why optical illusions work so reliably. The lines on the page do not change, yet the image seems to move, bend, or distort. These illusions are not tricks of the eyes. They are demonstrations of how strongly your brain relies on prior expectations. When the incoming data conflicts with what your brain expects, the brain does not immediately abandon its model. It negotiates, it compromises, and sometimes it simply chooses the prediction that feels more plausible than the data itself. Your experience of your own body is governed by the same principles. You do not directly feel your body as it is. You feel your brain's model of what your body should be doing. This is why phantom limbs can hurt. This is why you can feel your phone vibrate when it has not. This is why you can feel tired, energized, heavy, or light in ways that are not strictly explained by physical measurements. Your body, as you experience it, is a prediction your brain maintains to regulate movement and protect you from harm. The feeling that perception is passive comes from the smoothness of this process. The brain is so efficient at predicting that you rarely notice the construction happening. The illusion is convincing because it works. But when it fails, the cracks become visible. In moments of surprise, confusion, or sudden danger, you feel the brain rapidly rewriting its predictions. Time seems to slow down. Details become vivid. This is your nervous system urgently updating its internal model to regain control. Your sense of reality is therefore not a direct transmission from the outside world. It is a simulation tuned for survival. You experience not what is, but what your brain believes you need to experience in order to stay alive and oriented. Truth, in this biological sense, is usefulness rather than accuracy. A perfectly accurate perception that is too slow would be fatal. A slightly distorted but fast and meaningful perception keeps you alive. This does not mean that the world does not exist. It means that your access to it is always mediated by a predictive system. You are never encountering reality raw. You are encountering your brain's interpretation of it, the room you are in, the faces you recognize, the sounds you notice, and the dangers you feel are all filtered through layers of expectation and meaning before they reach your awareness. Even your thoughts follow this same architecture. You do not think in response to reality alone. You think in anticipation of it. Plans, worries, hopes, and fears are predictions about what might happen and what you might need to do. Your mind is constantly rehearsing possible futures, running simulations, and adjusting your emotional state accordingly. Much of your mental life is not about the present moment at all. It is about preparing for what might come next. Because perception is predictive, it is also deeply personal. Two people can stand in the same place and experience two different worlds. One sees opportunity, the other sees threat. One hears criticism, the other hears guidance. The same words, the same expressions, the same environment, yet completely different realities. Their brains are running different models, shaped by different histories, beliefs, and emotional patterns. Once you begin to understand this, it becomes harder to treat your experience as absolute truth. You begin to notice how much of what you call reality is actually interpretation. This does not make your experience meaningless. It makes it flexible. It means that changing your expectations can change your world, not metaphorically, but neurologically. Your brain is always trying to stay one step ahead of the present moment. It is not reacting to life. It is predicting it, shaping it, and then experiencing its own predictions as reality. You are not watching the world happen. You are participating in the continuous generation of what the world feels like to you. And that process never truly pauses because the present is always being assembled just before it arrives. Before anything in your life feels real, it must first be constructed inside your brain. You never meet the world directly. You only ever meet the brain's internal version of it. Every color you see, every sound you hear, every face you recognize, and every emotion you feel has already been translated, filtered, interpreted, and assembled into a coherent experience before it reaches your awareness. The reality you live in is not a raw transmission from the outside. It is a carefully organized internal simulation that feels immediate and unquestionable precisely because it has been running since before you had words to describe it. Your senses are not windows. They are data channels. They deliver incomplete, delayed, and ambiguous signals that mean nothing on their own. A pattern of light waves is not a tree. A vibration in the air is not a voice. A change in pressure is not a hand. These things become meaningful only after your brain imposes structure, category, and interpretation onto them. Long before you consciously recognize anything, your nervous system has already decided what it most likely is and what it most likely means for your survival. The world feels stable because your brain works relentlessly to make it feel that way. It smooths transitions, fills in gaps, ignores irrelevant noise, and highlights what it believes matters most. When you turn your head, the visual scene does not smear or collapse into chaos because your brain is actively stitching each moment into a seamless narrative. You are not watching reality unfold. You are being guided through a curated version of it that has been edited for clarity, speed, and usefulness. This internal construction is so effective that you forget it is happening at all. The simulation disappears into the background, leaving only the experience. You do not feel like you are looking at a mental model of a room. You feel like you are in a room. You do not feel like you are hearing an internal reconstruction of a voice. You feel like someone is speaking to you. The illusion is complete not because it is deceptive, but because it is efficient. What you experience as out there has already been shaped by what is in here. Your past experiences, emotional history, cultural learning, and personal expectations are continuously shaping the world you perceive. A crowded street can feel exciting, overwhelming, or threatening depending on which internal model is active. The street itself does not change. The reality you experience does. This also explains why memory and imagination feel so similar to perception. When you remember a place, your brain reconstructs many of the same patterns of activity that were present when you first experienced it. When you imagine a future scenario, your brain uses those same internal systems to simulate what might happen. The brain does not strictly separate seeing, remembering, and imagining. All three rely on internal constructions. The difference is not in the machinery, but in the source of the data guiding the model. Your sense of time is also part of this construction. You do not experience a continuous stream of raw moments. You experience a structured narrative, organized into a story with a past, present, and future. This story is assembled from memory, current sensory input, and predicted outcomes. The feeling that you are moving forward through time is another internal model, one that helps you maintain continuity and plan actions. Time, as you feel it, is not just something that happens to you. It is something your brain is actively organizing. The same applies to meaning. Nothing in the external world arrives labeled with importance. Meaning is assigned internally based on what your nervous system believes is relevant to your survival, goals, and social belonging. A glance can feel like rejection. A message can feel like hope. A silence can feel like danger. These experiences are not properties of the physical stimuli themselves. They are properties of your internal construction. Your emotional world is therefore not a reaction to reality alone. It is a reflection of your internal model of reality. Anxiety is not simply fear of what is happening. It is fear of what your brain predicts might happen. Joy is not just pleasure in the present. It is a signal that your predictions are aligning with your needs and expectations. Every feeling you have is an interpretation of your internal simulation, rather than a direct response to raw events. When the brain's construction shifts, reality shifts with it. Under the influence of certain chemicals, in dreams, or during deep meditation, the internal model can loosen its grip. Colors become more vivid, time distorts, the sense of self softens, and familiar environments can feel strange. The external world has not changed. The internal rendering has. You are momentarily seeing a different version of reality generated by the same brain. This means that your lived world is not simply a place. It is a process. It is something that is constantly being rebuilt, frame by frame, based on probability, memory, emotion, and expectation. You are not standing in a fixed reality. You are moving through a continuously updated internal environment that only exists as long as your brain maintains it. Understanding this does not separate you from reality. It reveals how deeply you are involved in creating it. You are not merely experiencing life. You are co-authoring the version of life that appears to you. The walls around you, the people you love, the challenges you face, and the future you imagine are all passing through an invisible filter that is shaping them into the world you recognize. Reality does not simply arrive at your senses. It is constructed inside your nervous system before it ever becomes your experience. You wake up in the morning with a quiet certainty that you are in charge of your life. You feel like a central decision maker, a commander behind your eyes who weighs options, forms intentions, and then sends orders to the body. When you reach for your phone, choose your words, or change your plans, it feels as though a single, unified you is steering the system. Control feels natural, obvious, and undeniable. But what if this feeling is not evidence of command, but evidence of explanation? Long before a movement happens, long before a word is spoken, long before a choice enters your awareness, your brain has already begun preparing it. Neural activity that predicts your actions can be detected before you consciously decide. The experience of deciding does not start the action. It arrives after the process is already underway. What you feel as intention is your brain's narrative about what it is doing, delivered in a form that feels personal and meaningful. The brain evolved to manage a complex body in a fast and uncertain world. It must constantly balance hunger, safety, social belonging, energy use, memory, and prediction. These processes are vast, parallel, and mostly unconscious. If you had to consciously oversee all of this, you would be overwhelmed and too slow to survive. So your nervous system does not present you with raw control. It presents you with a story of control. That story gives coherence, continuity, and accountability to a system that would otherwise feel chaotic. When you say, "I chose," what you are actually doing is assigning authorship to the outcome your brain has already assembled. This is not deception in a malicious sense. It is a useful simplification. A creature that feels responsible for its actions can learn from mistakes, adjust behavior, and be trusted by others. The sense of agency is a social and biological tool. It is not a direct report of the brain's internal mechanics. This is why sometimes you surprise yourself. You say things you did not plan to say. You feel emotions that appear without invitation. You make choices you later question. These are not failures of character. They are glimpses into the deeper machinery that is constantly running beneath your conscious awareness. Your conscious you is not running the whole system. It is receiving a summary. The feeling of control is strongest when the system is running smoothly. When your predictions align with your environment, your actions feel intentional and natural. But when that alignment breaks, control begins to feel shaky. In moments of stress, fatigue, fear, or excitement, your behavior can shift dramatically. You may act impulsively, freeze, or overthink. The same brain is still in charge, but the internal model that generates your sense of authorship is being challenged. Your brain does not show you its uncertainty. It shows you a simplified version of itself that feels confident and centered. This is why even in situations where you have little actual control, you still feel like a decision maker. The narrative of agency remains intact because it is more useful than a narrative of helplessness. A system that believes it can influence outcomes is more likely to act, adapt, and persist. This also explains why habits can feel so automatic and yet still feel like you. Repeated behaviors are stored as predictions about what usually happens in certain contexts. When those contexts appear, the brain runs the associated pattern. You experience the action as something you are doing, even though it was initiated by a deeply learned model rather than a fresh decision. Control feels present because the system attributes the action to your identity. Even your moral sense is shaped by this process. You feel responsible not only for what you do, but for who you believe you are. Guilt, pride, shame, and confidence are emotional signals designed to maintain consistency in the internal story of agency. They reinforce the idea that there is a stable self behind the actions. This keeps your social world predictable. It makes promises meaningful. It allows trust to exist. Yet beneath this story, the brain remains a predictive system, continuously updating itself based on outcomes. When something goes wrong, your nervous system adjusts future behavior, often before you consciously analyze what happened. You feel like you learned a lesson, but much of that learning occurred automatically. The conscious narrative arrives later, giving you a sense of authorship and continuity. Understanding this does not make you powerless. It clarifies what power really is. You do not command your brain like a machine operator. You influence it by changing patterns of attention, environment, repetition, and emotional meaning. By altering what you practice, what you focus on, and what you emotionally reinforce, you reshape the predictions that generate your future actions. Your sense of control is not an illusion to be dismissed. It is an interface. The self that feels in charge is not the engine. It is the dashboard. It gives you a readable summary of a system that would otherwise be invisible. And because it feels personal, it allows you to participate in your own change. The feeling of agency is therefore not a lie. It is a carefully crafted biological explanation that keeps a complex organism functional, adaptable, and socially coherent, even though the true mechanics of choice are distributed, automatic, and largely hidden from conscious view. Once you begin to understand that your sense of self, your perception, and your feeling of control are all constructions generated by a predictive brain, something subtle but profound begins to change in how you relate to your life. The world does not suddenly disappear. Your responsibilities do not vanish. Your relationships do not lose their meaning. But the way you interpret everything starts to soften. The rigid edges of identity begin to loosen. The heavy armor of certainty begins to feel less necessary. Fear is often the first thing to change. Much of what you worry about is not what is actually happening, but what your brain predicts might happen. Anxiety is the emotional color of an internal simulation running ahead of the present moment. Once you recognize that your nervous system is continuously forecasting futures, you start to notice that many of your fears are not warnings from reality itself, but products of internal models shaped by memory and past experience. This does not make fear vanish, but it gives you a small distance from it. You begin to observe fear rather than immediately becoming it. Identity also becomes less rigid. You stop feeling like you must defend a fixed version of who you are. You realize that your personality, your habits, your emotional reactions, and even your self-image are learned patterns that can be updated. This opens the door to growth that does not feel like self-betrayal. You are not abandoning yourself when you change. You are refining the model your brain is using to represent you. Growth becomes an act of alignment rather than an act of conflict. Other people start to feel different too. When you realize that everyone is living inside their own internally generated reality, misunderstandings become easier to hold with compassion. You begin to see that disagreements are often not about facts alone, but about different predictive models shaped by different histories. Someone else's anger, withdrawal, or defensiveness stops feeling purely personal. It begins to look like the behavior of another nervous system trying to protect itself based on its own internal simulations. This understanding also reshapes how you relate to your thoughts. You stop treating every thought as a command or a verdict. You begin to see them as signals, suggestions, and rehearsals generated by a predictive machine. Some thoughts are useful. Some are outdated. Some are simply noise. This awareness gives you space to choose which patterns you want to reinforce. You become less entangled with the stream of mental activity and more able to influence its direction through attention, repetition, and emotional meaning. Meaning itself starts to shift. You no longer look for purpose as something hidden somewhere outside of you, waiting to be discovered. You begin to understand that meaning is something your nervous system assigns to experiences based on what it believes matters for survival, connection, and fulfillment. Purpose is not found like a lost object. It is generated through the stories you tell yourself, the values you reinforce, and the futures you choose to imagine. This gives you a quiet creative power over the shape of your life. Even suffering begins to change in texture. Pain is still painful, loss is still heavy, But you start to recognize that the emotional weight you carry is deeply tied to the predictions your brain makes about what those events mean for your future. When those predictions soften, the suffering softens too. You may still grieve, but you are less likely to be consumed by narratives of permanence, hopelessness, or personal failure. You are able to experience pain without turning it into an identity. Your relationship with time changes as well. You become more aware of how much of your mental life is spent rehearsing futures that may never arrive. You begin to return more often to the present moment, not as a forced discipline, but as a natural consequence of understanding how much of your anxiety lives in internal simulations. Presence becomes less about effort and more about clarity. Responsibility also gains a new shape. You do not feel less responsible for your actions. You feel more skillfully responsible. Instead of trying to control yourself through willpower alone, you start to shape your environment, your routines, your relationships, and your mental habits in ways that influence the predictive patterns of your brain. You work with your biology rather than against it. Change becomes practical rather than purely motivational. Life starts to feel less like a rigid script and more like an evolving narrative you are actively participating in. You stop waiting to find yourself and start noticing how you are continuously creating yourself through what you practice, what you believe, and what you emotionally reinforce. You begin to see that who you are is not a destination, it is a process. And in this quiet shift of perspective, something else emerges, a deeper sense of gentleness towards yourself and others, a recognition that beneath every behavior is a nervous system trying to predict, protect, and survive. A realization that the human experience is not a performance of perfect control, but an ongoing negotiation between biology, memory, emotion, and meaning. When you see yourself and others through this lens, life becomes less about judgment and more about understanding. Less about defending identities and more about shaping futures. Less about fearing change and more about learning how to participate in it with awareness, compassion, and curiosity.